Welcome to this public lecture, which we will try to start on time, sorry. Thank you for attending the lecture. Please note that there are about 25 people that are online, so we have a fairly good turnout. And we're very, very pleased to have Professor Peter Loewen, who is the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, an institution that has many dimensions. And it was very interesting to have him here and to find out about the work of the Munk School. He's also a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Peter Loewen, that's a kind of Mennonite name. Comes from North Bay, Ontario. I have to mention this, which is next to Sudbury, which was so badly polluted by the nickel factory that there were no trees, and the US used that location to practice landing on Mars. So he received his bachelor's degree from Mount Allison University, which is a beautiful, small residential university, an excellent school, one of the often ranked as the best undergraduate education in the province of Alberta, in a very small town in New Brunswick. And he received his PhD from Université de Montréal, which is the French university in Montreal, which is quite an achievement. Had to learn French, and did postdocs at the University of British Columbia and in California, and held visiting positions in Melbourne, the School of Government, and Center for Democratic Politics at Princeton, and has been in touch on and off, has had discussions with James Kasimlaka on and off over the last little while, and has come to visit us. He visited Narin, and you may wish to ask him about his impressions. But the lecture is on what is the future of democratic societies. That's a very good topic because we live in the region where this is an existential question. And there are many dimensions to it. So Peter, thank you very much for taking the time to travel to our university. And thank you very much for offering to give a lecture, and look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very, very much for that introduction. I do want to say just a couple of words of thanks right off the top, and say that it's a real distinct privilege for me in my life to have been able to come to Kyrgyzstan for the last few days. I visited Kazakhstan just before, and to Boris said you might want to ask me about my experience, and I'll just tell you, which is that I found it to be a breathtaking experience to make the trip up the winding road to Narin, and to come upon that valley and to see the absolutely magnificent structure that's been built there. I've long been a believer, I think as many of us are, that beautiful places are good for the mind, that being in beautiful settings and being among well-designed things is actually clarifying for our thought. And I was deeply impressed by the campus. But the thing that I was most impressed by was that I had sort of the lucky occasion of being there as senior students. Most of the campus was empty, of course, because students are off, but seniors were finishing their projects and defending them. And seeing that combination of kind of nervousness and excitement, anticipation and energy among those students, and to hear them talk about their projects was quite a remarkable thing. And it's most remarkable because I could have been, I think, at any world-class university in the world having conversations like that, and it would have been with students of that quality, with students talking about projects of that diversity and of that interest. And lest you think that I'm not the luckiest person in the world, one of the students who I met, Ida Yesimova, wrote a novel that are only for her final project. It's called On the Other Side of the Rainbow. It's stories about LGBTQ plus people that she researched in Kazakhstan and then fictionalized. And there were 15 copies printed, and she gave me one So I've read half of it. I'm going to bring it home to Toronto and read the half. And I know that my wife is going to voraciously consume it because she's a huge reader of fiction, and it's quite good writing. So all that is a long way of saying, a long way of actually just doing a little bit of an expression of my appreciation for the chance to be here, and to see you, and to see this wonderful institution, which Shamsh has told me so much about with such enthusiasm, and which has not been exaggerated in the least. So let me say that I want to talk to you today about a question which is one that really is at the center of a lot of things I think about, but not what I talk about too much. So I really want to work through today with you some ideas that I have, and to engage with you on these and hear your reflections on these. And the basic question motivating what I want to talk about today is, what is the future of democratic societies? Are they bright or are they bleak? Is it the case that democracies are purpose-built or are fit for the challenges that are coming in the future? Or is it the case that this series of different types of democratic societies and systems of democratic government that we've built up are actually not fit for the future, and instead should be rethought? To be sure, there is a lot of concern about what some people call democratic backsliding in the world, the idea that democratic societies are in retreat. And I think there's some evidence, actually good evidence on both sides of this. For example, Freedom House, which is you would know is an American organization that measures a whole number of elements of civil and political rights in countries, up until 2023, observed there was about a 20-year decline in the global balance of freedoms in the world, that more countries were becoming less free than were becoming more free. And that has since corrected itself a little bit actually in the last year. But that statistic still raises quite a bit of alarm. And it's not hard when you kind of scan across the world to imagine that democracies might be on the retreat. There's a rise of China. There's a certain, what I might call a kind of confident authoritarianism in the Chinese system. It's one that has an immense amount to be proud of, having lifted as many people out of poverty as it has, and having raced into modernity in the fashion that it has, and having, frankly, over the last number of years, built out a government which is largely responsive to the needs and the preferences of citizens, which listens to them in their own way, which has done a good job, actually, over time of rooting out localized corruption, doing all the kinds of things that we think democratic governments would be good at. There are cases which are a little bit closer to our democratic societies, though they don't fall into that family, sort of competitor cases like Singapore, deeply successful country which has been a model for the world of rapid development, and yet has elements of it which are quite plainly non-democratic and even anti-democratic when you engage with people who live in that society. And then within our own democratic countries, there are some that really are on uncertain trajectories. If you follow the Israeli case closely, which I happen to do, Israeli democracy has gone through a remarkable set of crises over the last year, in which I think you can say fairly, in an effort to simply ensure his own political future, Benjamin Netanyahu has been willing to imperil the fundamental democratic institutions of Israeli society. You have cases like Hungary, where someone like Viktor Orban, who was once a liberal, now governs in a fashion which is increasingly, I think, fairly characterized as being anti-democratic, or maybe merely just non-democratic. Then you have the world's largest democracy, India, which has been in many ways an effective, sometimes rough, but effective model of pluralism and democratic scale for the world, and finds itself under a lot of duress and under a lot of strain, and much of it generated by the prime minister of that country. So these are kind of the big picture, some of the big picture setup for democracies. But I actually want to, and they're the ones that we talk about a lot, sort of our democracies as we understand them today, becoming more or less effective and more or less democratic globally. But what I'd like to do actually is to just refocus the question just a little bit and ask the following question about whether democracies are actually fit for purpose for the challenges that are coming for them. Which is to say that, are they institutionally prepared to deal with the way the world is going to be in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 years? I think we want to just to lay out sort of the framework a little bit. I want us to be sure that you understand that I think that democracies have been remarkably successful in generating good social outcomes and in increasing social welfare. So just to give you some senses of things that have happened over the last 50, 100, 200 years. and in which democracies have played a central role. You know, the world has changed dramatically in terms of things like child mortality. 200 years ago, 44% of children died before their 5th birthday. Today, it's 4%. Basic literacy has increased 8-fold in 200 years. The share of people with a clean water source has increased from 60% 50 years ago to 90% today. Fewer people are dying in wars. Wars are less common. This might be hard to believe that, but the statistics are quite clear on this. Within democracies, there's more enfranchisement than there's ever been, which is to say more people have the right to vote and the opportunity to participate electorally. We have an ever-expanding sense of civil rights or understanding of civil rights within democracies, and you do see retrenchments now and then, but the trend towards more and more and wider expanded civil rights is undeniable. Fewer people die from natural disasters and fewer people are malnourished. Indeed, it's a third of what it was in 1970. That's not true only of democracies, and this is important. It's not true only of democracies, but it is true that there's less variance in democracies, that democracies have consistently done better on those measures than non-democracies. And it's a consistency with which democracies have been able to achieve good outcomes for citizens, which are stunning. Because when you think about them achieving good outcomes for citizens, what you're saying, or what I'm saying in essence, is that in terms of some of the biggest challenges facing people over the last 100 years, democracies have done a very good job of advancing their societies. The old observation of Amartya Sen, which you might know, is that famines don't happen in democracies. And there is a generalization here, right? That democracies have consistently improved living conditions for people. So they've been successful, even if they haven't been sort of end of history making institutions that we once thought that they were. Now, the past is not necessarily a prologue to the future. So what I want to do is ask the question whether democracies, in fact, are fit for challenges of the future. I want to, in doing that, be clear to you that I'm putting aside my own neutrality here. I am, in some sense, a Democrat. I have a fundamental normative believer that democracies are good, that they have inherent value in them, which in a principled ethical way we would want to choose if we had a choice. So the purpose of the lecture in some ways is to consider some of the major challenges democracies will face over the next 30 years. And hopefully in our discussion, having set up the problems, you can share with me some of the solutions, and then I can leave here much smarter than I came. So what are the 5 challenges that I think that democracies are going to wrestle with over the next 30, 40, 50 years? One set of challenges is what I'll call the challenge of maintaining democratic representation. That is just continuing to do the work of putting into place policies which improve the lives of citizens, which citizens want, and for which politicians are rewarded or are removed. And I'll talk about that in more detail. The second is confronting the kind of technology-driven inequality that's coming for our societies and the labor market disruption that's coming for our societies. That's not only going to be about ChatGPT, but we're going to talk about it a little bit. The third is wrestling with demographic change. There's 2 parts of that. One is about what the actual dynamics of population levels are in the world, but the more important one is the more familiar shifts in the distribution of populations within countries, which I think are going to have fundamental challenges for democratic societies, electoral politics in the coming years. There's a small matter of tackling climate change, and then there's the equally small matter of maintaining a peaceful international order. So let's talk about challenge 1, that is maintaining democratic representation. This is something where I do most of my research, that is trying to understand within democracies, mostly European and Anglo-American democracies, understanding the quality of democratic representation, which is to understand the degree to which governments actually deliver on the things which citizens want them to do, or at least things which are good for citizens, the things which are in their interests. And this is at its core meant to be the magic of democracy, right? That we set up a system in which politicians are selected by citizens, are vessels for their preferences, and then are judged on the quality of the work that they do as politicians, and they're either removed or they're affirmed in those positions. There's a remarkable sort of chain of representation, as I put it in other places, that has to occur for democracy to work in this way. It has to assume that citizens actually know what they want, or that they know what's good for them. It assumes that politicians are aware of those things, that they actually have some sense of what citizens want them to do, that they're actually able to then act on those preferences, to put in place policies which move government closer to what citizens want, not farther away. And then citizens have to be able to see that politicians do that and then reward the ones who do it well and punish the ones who do it poorly. So that might sound like kind of political science 101. And it sounds like, I hope, a fairly plain description of how we think our democratic systems work. But the problem is that at almost every link in that chain of representation, evidence is becoming clearer and clearer that it doesn't actually work that way in the real world. Citizens don't have consistent, rational preferences about what they want governments to do. Politicians don't actually know what citizens want them to do. I'll talk about that more in a second. And politicians are, it seems, not actually able to make decisions better than the rest of us would. That is, when we elect them, they don't become experts at what they do. Let me just give you a couple of pieces of evidence of this, so we have a bit more empirics and a bit less speculation. For the last number of years, colleagues and I have been engaging with politicians directly. We did it first in 3 countries, then in 6, and now in 14, where we spent a lot of time in the offices of politicians interviewing them, giving them surveys that we asked them to fill out, testing them on things. And among the things that we test them on is we'll put in front of them some issue, and we'll say, we've just surveyed a representative sample of citizens in your country. We know what their views are on a particular issue. What percentage of people in your country do you think would support this policy action? So what we're doing really is measuring politicians' knowledge of what citizens want them to do. And the truth is, when you actually look at politicians systematically at how well they can do that versus regular citizens, a couple of things emerge. One is they're slightly better than flipping a coin at guessing on what side of a majority citizens are, but not much better than that. And they're not systematically better than citizens. These are national level politicians in countries that we think of as effective democracies: Canada, Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Australia. I can go on and on with the ones that we've worked in. Sweden, Denmark. But the story that comes out of it is that politicians are systematically biased and incorrect in what they think citizens want them to do. When we similarly give politicians sort of basic economic tasks to make decisions where we measure whether they chase after sunk costs, whether they escalate commitment, whether they have hyperbolic discounting, all the things that we teach students in Economics 101 about what you don't want to do, the evidence is that politicians engage in those cognitive anomalies as much as regular citizens do. It's just a long academic way of saying that they're actually not that good at making decisions and not much better than the rest of us. Now, there's some magic in the system that makes it all work in the end. It's probably some combination of public pressure and public servants and media and things challenging politicians to make good decisions. But the reality of it is that when we actually look at how well they do their jobs, it's actually hard for them to do. Now, this is not a huge surprise in some ways, right? We expect politics to be done by humans who have all the same limited capacities that all the rest of us have because they are humans. And we expect them to do it with problems that are increasingly complex in an environment where there's increasing amounts of also noise, but scrutiny and criticism at the same time. And we expect them to do it with governments that are actually not probably big enough for them to do those things. We talk often about sort of the inexorable rise in the size of government, right? The governments and public services keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But here's an interesting reality, right? The size of Canada in population has increased tenfold since Confederation, since 1867, so 156 years. While the population's increased tenfold, the size of the House of Commons, that is the number of politicians we've tasked with representing us, has barely doubled. We have fewer and fewer politicians doing more and more difficult jobs. And then there are other problems that make it very difficult for them to maintain this closeness to citizens. We have changing patterns of information consumption. People increasingly live in environments where they don't share common information with other people, where they live in what's sometimes characterized as echo chambers or filter bubbles. They have less and less of a common base of information or even a common base of truth. Citizens are becoming much more polarized in terms of their views, not only of politicians, but of other people. Politicians are dealing with increasingly complex problems that are increasingly difficult to solve. And underneath all of that is a declining rate of trust in political institutions and in politicians. So the amount of room to maneuver they have, the amount of authority they have to take on their jobs is arguably lower while the problems get much more serious. I don't have a quick solution for this or an answer for how we actually deal with this challenge of it being more and more difficult to be a politician. But we have to recognize that at the core of democratic systems is a belief that humans should be governed by other humans. And those humans have a fundamental challenge in dealing with the complexity of the problems that are facing us. Challenge number 2 for democracies is confronting technological change. So much of politics, electoral politics at least, in the democratic world turns around labor markets, right? It turns around the question of who's going to get what for their labor, how much of it can they keep, how much are they going to give to the government, and how is that going to be distributed across different groups. And where you fall on the ideological dimension of that has structured party politics for a long time in our societies. Now, there's been massive change, of course, in the past in the nature of labor and the nature of production, but we're arguably on not the precipice, but we're coming up to a point where there's arguably a potential for as much change as there was during the Industrial Revolution. Now, artificial intelligence comes up with some new technology every 6 months that blows our mind. And I don't want to tell you a story about how there's one new technology coming that's going to change everything. And I want to remind you that the Industrial Revolution didn't just start with the printing press, then everything changed overnight, right? It took a long time for automation at that scale to come along and for urbanization to come along. But it fundamentally disrupted politics over a 50, 60-year period forever after it, right? And I think it's very reasonable for us to think that we're on an inflection point in what technology is going to do to change the way we work and to change the way we relate to people. And I'll just tell you 3 of the things that I think are doing it. One is that the rate of technological change is actually increasing at a higher rate, in the sense that the second derivative, if you think about it, the rate of change is changing more quickly than it was before. You can see that in things like large language models, but even in automation and robotics, things are increasing at an increasingly fast clip. As quantum computing becomes a reality and you can actually unlock greater computing power at a rate that defies Moore's law, then it gets even more potentially disruptive. And the nature of what is behind these ChatGPT models, that is to say, large language models, which are able to effectively at least mimic speech and mimic thought, but actually probably are capable of making inference and communicating it into language, is different than anything we've ever seen before. I want you to think about where value lies in a university or where value lies in a law firm. So if you have the unfortunate fate of having to hire a lawyer to argue something for you in court, right? What's the basis of the payment that you make to the lawyer? Well, the actual mechanical basis of it is you generally pay them for the amount of time that they have to spend on the case, right? Now, what is that time spent doing? It's partially spent in deploying their expertise to the case, looking at it, analyzing it, thinking about it, devising a strategy through which they're going to pursue the case. But a good bit of that time is actually captured up simply in the writing of the case and of making the argument, right? And that's where a lot of the value is generated in a sense, right? Well, we're at a place now where if you, for example, went into OpenAI's ChatGPT and you said, write me a policy brief tomorrow for the Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan on the 3 actions he should take to address climate change. ChatGPT can return to you a policy memo that's 2,000 words, has pretty good arguments at the core of it, and it can do it in a matter of about 45 seconds. So that work, which would have taken a good policy analyst a couple of days in the actual writing, in the production of it, is now minimized almost down to 0. You still have to think. You've got to check the arguments of this thing because it could be wrong. It could have the context wrong. But the actual production of language is now happening at a rate and at a speed that we've never seen before. The reason why this is potentially very, very disruptive is really 2 reasons. One is that it starts to apply to a much larger class of jobs than it would have applied to before. The estimates that McKinsey and other companies would come up with for how demonstrable technologies could change labor markets, even up to 2 years ago, was all about whether you did a manual repetitive task. But if you had creativity at the core of your job, if you had original thought at the core of your job, if you had inference at the core of your job, you were okay. You're not okay anymore. And the second way it's very disruptive is that it can fundamentally change the nature of social relations. So sometimes, I don't know if you've had this experience, but you have a problem with your phone bill or you have a problem with a flight booking. You don't want to talk to a person on the phone, so you deal with a chat agent, right? And you find yourself interacting with another human through text. Well, there's an assumption about who that person is behind there, right? That they could reason with a certain amount of morality and maybe compassion. They can maybe understand the meaning of what you're saying. And there is something about being heard by a human, which is very important, right? We want decisions to be made by other people, not to be made by machines. But we're at the place now where not only do machines have the capacity to make decisions for us, but they have the capacity to communicate with us in a sense where we don't know if we're communicating with a human or communicating with a machine. And that has, I think, really serious implications for how we think about the moral relationships between people in an economy. Now, what does that have to do with politics and with democratic politics? It has a lot to do with it in the following sense: that the disruption that's going to come to labor markets, to people who are working and are making money doing something and are suddenly going to find themselves unable to make money doing that, that disruption doesn't have a good set of policy responses to it. The kind of labor retraining and the way of thinking about the restructuring of economies is not something that policymakers are doing enough to think about right now. That's problem A. Problem B is that citizens are deeply unaware of how exposed they are to these risks. And colleagues and I have done a lot of surveying of people now in dozens of countries about how exposed they think they are to AI risk and how exposed they are in reality. And the non-correlation between those is quite frightening. And the third one is that the way our politics has been structured ideologically around effectively disputes over labor or disputes over capital after all these years doesn't work to actually structure the problems that are coming. So there's just a huge political disruption that's coming as people find themselves dislocated and just and changed by AI sweeping through society. So it's a fundamental challenge for political parties to be able to come up with some set of policies and some set of ways of some set of kind of ideas and policy offerings that are going to be able to deal with this challenge. The third major challenge is change in the world's population. So this is actually, for me, a fundamentally interesting question, which is whether we're getting more people in the world or whether we're getting fewer. I think if you survey people, if we did a show of hands in here, most people would think that the world's population is going to keep on growing inexorably, but actually demographers don't believe that to be the case. The debate among demographers right now is when depopulation will start in the world. And if you look at the most recent UN estimates, they estimate that population will peak at around 11 billion in the year 2100. There's other very credible estimates that it'll actually peak at a lower level than that, around 9.5 billion in 2070. So not only will it peak at a lower level, but it'll peak and start to decline more quickly. This has massive implications for things like sustainability and for climate change, for our toll on the planet, for global economic output, for the relative size of countries. Now, underneath all of these debates about total population and when it will, in fact, peak, are a couple of more undeniable facts, right? One is, the most important one is about the relative size of young and old people in societies. And this, to me, is a fundamental break point that we're democratic societies are going to have to deal with. Let me just put some flesh on this so you can get a sense of why this is a problem. The basic problem in many advanced democracies, it's not true in Kyrgyzstan. When we can talk about the exceptions in a second, but the basic problem in most advanced economies and democracies is the following: too many old people and not enough young people, right? How bad's the problem? Let's take 5 countries just as an example: the US, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Sweden. Okay, chosen them for essentially random reasons. So in 1990, for every 100 people between 20 and 64, that is, say, for every 100 people who are productively working and paying taxes, there were 22 people aged 65 and over in the United States. So if you had 100 working people, they were supporting 22 people in their retirement. So you had something like 4.5 working people for each person in their retired age. 1950, it was just 14.2 retired per 100 working. Okay. So let's talk about where was Canada in 1990, for example. Canada, 18 to 100, Japan, 19 to 100, South Korea, 9 to 100, Sweden, 31 to 100. Pretty good, right? In most places, you've got at least 3 times 3 working people for every person who's not working. So lots of variation, but two trends start changing those numbers, right? One is people are living longer, and the second is people are having kids later or they're having fewer children. So we're getting older people and they're not being replaced by younger people. So what happens by 2020, just 30 years later? Well, in the US, the number of people retired per 100 working people increased from 22 to 28. In Canada, from 18 to 30. In Japan, from 19 to 52. South Korea, from 9 to 24. And Sweden, from 31 to 36. In every country, it increased between 1990 and 2020. Here are the estimates for 2050. In the US, there'll be 40 retired people for every 100 working people. Just 2.5 people of working age supporting people who are retired. In Canada, it will be similar, 45 per 100. In Japan, it will be 81 retired people per 100 working people. Korea, 79 per 100. In Sweden, 46 per 100. No cherry picking of the numbers here. The OECD average was 20 per 100 working people in 1990, 31 per 100 in 2020, and 52 per 100 in 2050. Why does this matter? It matters for some really serious reasons. One is that fundamental to our, one of the fundamental things that democracies have done well in the last 100 years is to make sure that people in their retirement and in their old age didn't live in poverty. It's one of the great things that we've been able to change as a society, right? That through some combination of social security or forced savings plus healthcare, people have not had to live in poverty when they were 80, 90, 100 years old. So that's one part, but that's made certain assumptions about who paid in and when we paid and what people got out for what they put in. This has major implications for the nature of work, for labor market protections, huge implications for healthcare and care for the elderly. But fundamentally, it's got huge implications for electoral coalitions. What's going to happen increasingly into the future is that young people, for whom the future of democratic societies is the most important because they're going to be living much longer into the future than people, unfortunately, who are old, that's just a fact of life, will be the least well served by democracies. Because they'll be asked, and we already see the contours of it now, to work longer hours, to support more people. When prices are higher, houses are harder to get to, education is more expensive. And I think this is a fundamentally challenging problem. And we see it in Canada, for example, in that in the last 10 years alone, the ability of a young person to buy a home by age 30 has essentially disappeared. Has a lot to do with people holding on to homes till they're late in life, but also has a lot to do with the multi-generational care they're giving, with the nature of how long they live at home, et cetera, et cetera. People then delay starting families as a result of that, and it just compounds. It kind of compounds the problem. So it's a really challenging issue. And then the other part that it actually intersects with in really interesting ways is the massive pressure that it's going to put on migration. So how have societies like Canada, the United Kingdom, to some extent the United States, decided to deal with this problem of not having enough young people? Well, we've done it by having really high rates of migration, by inviting people into our societies to come into work and to start lives there. This is a real challenge. Canada's been incredibly blessed, of course, by being able to maintain high rates of migration. But we're at a point now where Canada this year will bring in 400,000 immigrants on a permanent basis, on a population basis of less than 40 million. It's just a huge number. It's almost unseen historically. And the bargain that we offer to those folks in terms of how much accessibility they'll have to a home, right? How long it will take them to be able to get their other family members here is getting increasingly worse. But we're going to need increasingly large numbers of people. And what that means is that we increasingly offer a less desirable and a less fair and a less just offer to people who come to our country because we need to make up for this demographic bulge. And at the same time that we're doing that, and other Western developed countries are doing it, what are they doing? We're trying to cherry pick or to draw away the most talented people from around the world. And it has a globally unfair effect on countries who are looking to build their own economies, their own democratic societies. So all those pressures that have already driven those dynamics, with which many of you will be familiar, are only going to get more serious as countries which are on the wrong end of this demographic bulge need to draw in more people. Challenge 4 is tackling climate change. I don't want to say too much about this because I'm not an expert at it and have some consciousness of time, except to say that if we take COVID as a case study, and I spent a lot of time working on how people over the COVID pandemic, on how Canadians were responding to it and surveying Canadians every week and surveying a lot of people globally, a couple of things became really clear to me about it. It's that citizens were really good at responding to the challenges that governments put in front of them. people were willing to stay home and they were willing to forgo time with their loved ones. They were willing to take vaccinations when they were offered. They were willing to give up some money by working less in order to take care of other people. That wasn't really the challenge. What was fundamentally the challenge was politicians, democratic leaders, communicating to citizens about why they were asking them to make these sacrifices, dealing with what we might call intertemporal trade-offs, asking them to make a sacrifice now for payoffs in the future, and building trust with citizens in a way where we could actually take on COVID for a long, long period of time. We thought there would be deference towards scientific expertise forever. There wasn't. People gave up on expertise within the second year of the pandemic. Governments thought that they could effectively only deal with one problem at a time, which is to deal with COVID, but not deal with the educational disruptions of it or the labor market disruptions. They couldn't do that. And COVID was not a complicated problem the way that climate change will be a complicated problem. So the challenge that comes out of watching COVID is the ability of politicians to communicate to citizens about the short-term sacrifices they needed to make to achieve long-term gains, to undergird it with scientific expertise, but to appeal to citizens as good moral people who cared about other people, and to do that in a way where they could consistently maintain trust. Worked for the first little while, but it fell apart almost globally by the second year of the pandemic. It was just last week or 2 weeks ago, right? If you open up the newspaper, the WHO said, hey, the global emergency for COVID is over. And everyone in the world said it was over a year ago, as far as we were concerned, right? Now, climate change will be not a problem forever. There are models and arguments that actually, once you get through a certain amount of warming, there's adaptation and, we'll get through it. I don't know if I buy that, but let's assume that is true. You're still talking about a 20, 30, 40-year proposition of massive change. And, there's not a lot of evidence from COVID that we're good with dealing with emergencies over a long period of time. And then finally, and then I'm really looking forward to questions and comments and brickbats and bouquets. There is the issue of where democracies are going to fit into a changing international order. And I'm not an expert on global politics, but I just want to make a couple of observations about this. One is going back to my first point. There are competitive systems that stand up against democracies, which have great appeal globally. And democracies have to face the challenge of actually appealing on their merits to people around the world about what democracies can deliver as opposed to other systems of government. And democracies have to do that in a way which takes not only international development, which we can talk a lot about in this context and in this room, but which takes partnership with other countries seriously, and which really recognizes that, the practice of advanced democracies taking the cream off the top of every country, of engaging in sometimes often exploitative trade relationships, isn't going to cut it anymore. That countries which are on the ascendance want to see partnership with democracies. They don't want to just see relationships of convenience from one side. So democracies have the obligation, if they're going to survive, and we're going to have a global order of democracies, of both backstopping emerging democracies, but also finding a way to set up a system of international order and of trade, and of genuinely rules-based engagement in a way that's going to be fair and going to be generative of prosperity for middle-income countries and for developing countries in a way that we actually haven't done very well, or as well as we could have over the last 60 years. I'll just say one more thing, which is when I think about what we're talking about here fundamentally is we're thinking about a renewal of the social contract, of a re-understanding of what it is that citizens owe one another and what it is that governments owe citizens over the course of their lifetimes. We're not very good, actually, at thinking about intergenerational trade-offs in our societies, of thinking about what old people owe young people, and of generating for young people a sense society-wide of what they owe their elders. We do it within our own moral value systems, we do it within our religions, we do it within local places, but at the level of democracies, at the level of a whole society, we don't do it as well as we could. So there's a certain democratic imagination which is required to fundamentally rethink what it is that democracies will give people over the course of their lifespan and what they'll give back to other people. And we need to do that in a context where the act of doing democracy and practicing politics is harder than it's ever been, in a context in which our demographic realities and our technological realities are changing very quickly in a very disruptive way, and in a way where, the globe that we all operate on is more uncertain and more fragile than it has been really for any time in the last 30 years. I'll just leave it at that, except to say thank you very, very much. It's been a real pleasure for me to be here at UCA.
Well, Peter, is this on, right? Okay, Peter, thank you very much for a wonderfully interesting and provocative, thought-provoking speech. That was also delivered in a very short period of time, so there's lots to discuss there. So we want to open up the floor to questions and comments, and we invite the 31 odd people who are online to participate and ask questions. Oh, they're here. So, artificial intelligence. Can we say there are multiple democracies today?
So I might just say something about the first two questions that are up there. One is the first one, which you can read. I don't know if folks at home can see, is good day to you as well. What role do you think artificial intelligence will play in shaping the future of democracy? From Gulizat. Maybe what I'll say is that to just narrow it a little bit, to talk somewhat about what the potential for artificial intelligence is to generate policy and to understand how we create better public policies. And this is actually something where I think there's a remarkable amount of promise. And the promise is both very deep and it's very broad. So let me just articulate that to you in a second. You know, our capacity to wrestle down data, to understand problems, and to use some combination of artificial intelligence and machine learning to understand problems is greater now than it's ever been. I'll give you, if you don't mind, I'll give you a good example from a conversation I had with one of the UCA students yesterday. I said, you know, what's your project that you're working on? He said, oh, I'm working on predicting air quality in Bishkek. Well, that's obviously that matters, right? I mean, air quality is fundamentally important to public health, especially for kids and for the elderly. And I said, how are you doing it? And he said, well, I got a hold of data on air quality in Bishkek over the last 20 years. Of course, he's got all sorts of other data that he can correlate with that. He developed a machine learning model with if you know this stuff, with an in sample and an out of sample prediction to train a number of models to figure out what things are the identifiable predictors of whether tomorrow is going to be a bad day for air quality in Bishkek, or whether it's going to be a good day. And these are things that economists and meteorologists and climate scientists could have done in the last 10 and 20 and 30 years. But it wasn't the case that the tools were as widely available and the computing power was as widely available and as widely known, so that a 22-year-old could figure that out and could build a credible model to do that. That just gives you a sense of the depth of what we can do in almost every policy area. We can wrestle to the ground more data and bring into it more powerful inferential or statistical tools to make predictions about what's going to go on. So in almost every policy area, we've got the potential for more insight about what's working or about what the relationships between things are. What are the relationships between things? But the second part of it is that, you know, for those of you who've worked in government, you sort of understand the way we think about policy and its impact. It's almost always very narrowly within the field in which you work or the portfolio in which you work. And the result of that is the following. The governments will do things like generate a number of social programs or income support programs across 3 or 4 ministries, which all individually might be welfare increasing for people who are subject to them, but which are actually counterproductive when put together. They cancel each other out through massive clawbacks on income tax rates, or they change incentives for behavior to go back to work, and that has welfare reducing effects. They cancel out the effects of the program, et cetera, et cetera. Our potential to develop models, not only AI models, but to develop models that will look at whole of government action and to understand, using all the data that's available to government, how one policy change will have an effect at individual levels, then averaged up across, all of the government department, is better than it's ever been before. 1940s and 50s macroeconomists in the 60s used to build these huge complex models where they thought they could model the whole economy. Effectively impossible to do because of computing power, inferential power as well, but computing power. But it's one which we're starting to achieve now. So the capacity to actually have really massive insights into how policies working across a whole economy is better than it's ever been. So that's the part where just within the actual act of democracy or public policy, AI is going to be remarkably effective. That's a long question there. Yeah, I saw this one. Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's actually a very fair question. It's a very good question. The way I would kind of reflect it back is that democracies which are here's an interesting question for you. Here's a little piece of trivia, and then it'll start to answer the question. Is Canada an old or a young democracy? Bodan, what do you think? Are we young or old?
I would say it's an old democracy because it goes on the history of the democratic development.
Yeah. So yes. So Bodan's argument is, Canada builds on the Magna Carta and the British tradition, and therefore we're an old democracy. Even if we didn't say that, Canada's had elections without interruption since 1867, which makes it, depending on how you measure it, the third or the fourth longest continually running electoral democracy in the world. This is a remarkable fact when I think about it, right? That we've had all sorts of democratic interruptions across most of the world, in which countries have reverted into different systems or have moved into different systems and sometimes come back to democracy. And we don't think of Canada as a particularly old democracy. And that's all a long way of saying that actually, in the grand sweep of history, none of these countries that are democracies now have been democracies for very long. So there's a lot of potential for evolution, obviously, for us to change. And we shouldn't be caught up in models that our exact conception of how electoral democracy works now must be the way that we think it's going to work, that it's going to work in the future. In a lot of ways, countries which are coming into democracy and which are bringing to it slightly differentiated cultural understandings of how democracy works, or different moral models to how democracy works, different understandings of how obligation to one another and long-running things like religion and culture fit into democracy, can really expand our imagination of how democracies work. So to the question of whether there are multiple democracies, of course there are, but why do we care about that? The reason why we care about it is because understanding how democracy works differently in different contexts is fundamental to understanding how it can adapt and change, right? To understanding its flexibility, its pliancy, its applicability in multiple places. Which one should we take next? Why don't you choose them, Bodan, because you can read them. Yeah.
Which I gather and change the democratic values. So in other words, if we change our nature, if we change our understanding of what democratic values are, then does that require that we have to transition to that, and what is the thing about services?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the question's almost begged in the sense that yes, if we develop different senses of democratic values, we have to have new democratic systems, right? So it's almost. But what I would say is the following. I don't know that I believe the following thing, but I'll give you a proposition that and maybe you'll find this interesting, or at least thought-provoking, which is that why would we think that the way we think about the planet and the way we think about animals today, for example, is going to be the way we think about them in 100 years from now? We have lots of traditions in the world which regard animals as much more than a food source, right? Which regard them as other creatures which should be treated with the same degree of rights that humans are treated with. I don't actually believe this in some sense, and I enjoy eating meat a lot, and I don't think I believe it, but I could imagine us in 100 years from now looking and saying, we know a lot more about animals than we knew before. We can generate food in a way that doesn't require the killing of other people. And boy, weren't we really rough creatures before that we would do that? How could we do that, right? Well, that's a conception of rights and an extension of them, which then has to come up with a new whole system of food generation, right? And would that change democratic values? Well, I don't know, but it's a pretty massive change. If you start thinking about whether things like, and there are traditions in the world which think that, who think that, bodies of water have rights or are living things that should be respected as living things, the way we respect other humans. Start to think about that, then how we think about the production of things and the treatment of the planet changes fundamentally. What's permitted and not permitted in a society changes fundamentally. And democratic societies would have to change to come up with those rights. And if you think that that sounds far-fetched, right? The story of civil rights within democracies for a long time has been transforming our understanding of who was a citizen, who was a human first, and then who was a citizen. And that's fundamentally changed the way we've conducted our politics, right? And it's been a change that a place like the United States is still working through, right? Societies like Canada are still working through our understanding of how much we've mistreated Indigenous populations and treated them as though they weren't rights-bearing people, and they were, right? So I think that, you know, those kind of fundamental questions about who matters in a democracy are going to matter a lot. To the second part of the question, which is about sort of transnationalism in some sense, you know, the nations are very effective things. Countries are very effective things as organizing units, right? You draw a boundary or a border around a place, and you know who's in and you know who's out. You know who you have an obligation to. You know who you don't have an obligation to. But we all know how kind of absurd it is, in a sense, to think that an arbitrarily drawn line makes a person on the other side of it someone to whom you don't have an obligation, right? So, you know, one part of the democratic imagination and its expansion is thinking about what we owe to people who don't live in the same polity that we do, right? And thinking about them as potential members of the same global democracy that we're a part of. And, you know, I'm not very sanguine about our capacity as a world to get to a place where we view each other, everyone, as being a part of the same community, because there are just dark forces that mitigate against that all the time. But as we get further and further, or closer and closer to that, then, you know, in some sense, democracy, if not just human values, demands that we be that we think about other people as being as deserving of help and citizenship and rights as we are, whether they're in the same country as us or not. In defense of old people, okay. Central Asia in the past, yeah. Yeah, I think it's a wonderfully well put question, right? That we think about, you know, we have a very, I mean, many people have written about this, but we have a very sort of interesting view of the way life should be, right? And that view is in some ways kind of structured around a sense that people are going to die when they're 65 or when they're 70, right? And you're going to work all this time to save a little bit of money, and then, you know, and then your family won't have to worry about you after 5 years. But it is true that for the elderly in our society, there's I mean, the huge revolutions for old folks, right, obviously are that there's all sorts of medical treatment that allows people to be ambulatory for a much longer period of time, to be able to walk and to move around for a much longer period of time, which makes people productive. It's incredibly good for your health, right? So that's a huge change. And that actually prolongs kind of productive, joyful, engaged living. And then we've got all sorts of things we're doing really on the back end of life to extend people's lives. And those are very, very expensive. And those really raise all sorts of interesting sort of moral questions. So I think that, you know, if you come up with a society that better values the contributions elderly folks can make, then it's all to the better, right? I think the fundamental challenge we have is actually not on the back end only, but it's actually at the starting end, right? And I say this as somebody who had children late in life, that it probably is fundamentally important that societies figure out how to get people to have more kids at an earlier age. And that sounds like that's a very like conservative traditional thing to say, but it really is an issue, and it's a difficult issue when you at the same time want to empower women to succeed in their lives doing whatever they want, right? On the timelines that they want, and in which you want to have kind of maximum educational opportunities, because those things mitigate against having more children. But this is the demographics of this are quite stark, and the need globally to have more children if we're going to curve off depopulation is a huge challenge. So it's a bigger challenge than actually, you know, thinking about life in later years in better ways.
I'm going to ask a question, if that's okay.
You have the microphone, you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that it's a comment, and it's a comment question in response to it. So when you think about democratic societies, I think we tend to think of it as a kind of electoral process, but actually democratic societies is a very complex thing. It's a series of rights and obligations. It's questions of courts and rule of law. It's civil liberties. It's about an open society, freedom of information, freedom of assembly. And these things are what make, one keeps forgetting that what democratic society is not sort of like one thing, but is a complex of behaviors and institutions that support that behavior.
Yes.
And there is compelling from political economy, there are compelling reasons why no country that is a low-income country is a democracy. And perhaps it's low income because it's not a democracy. Virtually no lower middle income country has gone to lower middle or middle income countries have progressed forward with very, very few exceptions, because the block to their development is the absence of these institutions. So you can call it the absence of democracy. But unless you have these institutions that function, which is rule of law, civil liberties, freedom of information, circulation of ideas, and free markets for innovation, you are never going to get to, you're never going to have economic advancement. And if you look at China, it accomplished a lot. But what was responsible for growth and technological innovation was the fact that it allowed private enterprise to develop that was not controlled. It created 80% of jobs. Whether China can sustain growth without these conditions, because this economic transformation also meant we need a sharing of power. And authoritarian regimes are not terribly, well, they don't want to share power. Yes. Neither are authoritarian regimes particularly good at providing sustained economic growth and innovation and this kind of stuff. So I think that one has to look at the kind of broader, if, you know, there is no undemocratic way to prosperity and to long-term prosperity. That's the evidence. Nobody has done that. And I think that's ultimately the very, very important thing about democratic societies and all the problems that you need to bear them. Yes. By the way, in terms of the Freedom House Index, Kyrgyzstan has slipped quite a lot. It's now a consolidated authoritarian state. Yes.
So let me say a couple of things. It's a provocative question. And I'll say two things. I mean, one is that I think you've characterized that kind of complex welter of things that we want in a democracy very well, right? This combination of, as you say, a rule of law and the things that characterize an open society, right? But I would say that it's very hard to identify one of those that doesn't have at the core of it an effective electoral mechanism. And I think that is the secret sauce for this, right? That politicians, as Tony Benn used to say, right? Politicians really live in fear that an old lady is going to walk into a polling place and with a piece of paper destroy them, right? So that's a fundamental piece to it. What I would say though is that moving from the past to the future, there are two uncertainties. One is, will China get through the middle income trap? And I think that it looks different than any other country that's come before it. So the jury's out, right? And I'm not. I think it's got some serious headwinds, but it's a serious. If anybody's going to do it, they'll do it. But the second thing is that the question that we, in some ways, the question that we have to answer is, you know, take Hungary, for example, right? I mean, can Hungary revert to being essentially in a competitive authoritarian state or an authoritarian state and still have all the economic goods that it's realized over the last number of years, right? It probably will be, right? But can the United States, right? I mean, how much democratic backsliding can the United States engage in, right? And it's engaging in it, right? But still maintain its economic dynamism and all the great things about its culture and its place in the world. Well, probably quite a bit of it, actually, right? So for democracies, in some ways, the question here isn't, are non-democracies going to become democracies, right? But it's how do democracies continue to live up to the kind of standards that we've normatively taken on, that have become endogenous to everything we're doing, and still take on these huge global challenges without losing their democratic character. Yes. Yeah, it depends a bit on what you mean by wealthy, right? And this is the other piece of it, right? Is that not most nearly, but the majority share of countries in the world today are wealthier than any country was 100 years ago, and people live better lives, right? And many of those countries are not democratic, right? Because just global trade and technological development, all these things that human development that we've experienced over the last 100 years have made many people better off, right? And that's happened in countries which were non-democratic, but just not at the trajectory that democratic countries have, right? So, over the long view, if we want to take a long view of 100 years or something like that, will those countries be forever stuck to catch up if they're not democratic? I think there's major limiting factors there, right? But the past doesn't predict the future, and for democracies themselves, I think a lot of these future challenges are ones that we haven't thought about before, and maybe aren't kind of sort of fit to take on. So that's the essence of what I'm trying to understand, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have couple of questions, and one is also related, I think, to what Bogdan just asked, but from a bit, I would say opposite angle. So, well, arguably, historically, democracies have never been a mainstream. And, well, the problems have been tackled. I mean, the problems of living together, of producing, of production, et cetera, even in non-democratic societies. So, and you consider democracies in terms of the efficiencies, how efficiently they tackle the problems. But I just wonder if this is why we actually value democracies. Is it because they are most effective, or there are other important normative concerns? And arguably, well, if, for example, we would find out, other regime which is more effective, does it mean we have to, or we should abandon democracies? So to me, this is kind of a deep philosophical question. It's not about economic prosperity, it's about rather normative dimension. So this is kind of a first thing. Second, you're talking about democracy in kind of very generic way. But if, for example, well, I mean, you obviously, talking about liberal representative democracies. But, well, there is of course, huge literature, like, agonistic pluralism of Charlotte Mouffe, or, I don't know, deliberative democracy, or Republican versions of democracies. Would they do better? So, for example, the problem of representation, democratic representation, which you mentioned, the first problem. Then is it really? It's not only the problem of representation, but it's the problem of democratic participation, because this is a split between representatives and ordinary citizenry. So would, for example, deliberative democracy, be kind of a solution to this problem? So what's about other versions of democracies, which are different from the current representative liberal type of the democracies?
Yeah, these are deeply as a bonus, these are deeply important questions and not easy ones to answer. I think I would say the following, Maxim, which is that one doesn't want to tell a story about all the deliberate choices that were made to make democracies the way they are, right? I mean, they are the result of very deep, often messy, conflictual social processes and political processes that have created the institutions that we've created, right? And often those institutions were created to solve a problem of the moment or to solve a political crisis of the moment, and then we just live with them after that, right? And whatever effects they have on our lives, we continue to live under them. So we don't, it's a fundamental error to tell a story about democracies being these enlightened institutions that people gathered together and peacefully decided on. In some cases that happened. In many cases, it's been the result of some really serious conflict. Now, that said, I think the empirical evidence, and this is Bowden's point largely, is that set or that welter of things that comes up out of democracies does generate good outcomes, right? So that's an empirical reason, but also a normative one to want to support democracies, not because they're fundamentally good in their designs, but because the proof's in the pudding and that they work, right, and producing better outcomes. My sense of how we should think about exploring different democratic institutions is the following, and I've got what I think are sometimes interpreted as conflicting views on this. One is that I think we should be very, very reluctant to change fundamental democratic institutions. So if you've come up with a way in your society to elect representatives and to hold them to account, you should really thank you very much. You should really just not play around with that. So I've been in my own country, I've been a huge opponent and a public one of reforming the electoral system, because I think that's just generated by political scientists who think that they can come up with a better system for everything. And it doesn't appreciate how endogenous these things are, right? So we should really not touch democratic institutions, fundamental ones, if the society is working. Don't try to optimize your courts. Don't try to optimize your electoral system. Accept that things have come up endogenously through a bunch of trial and error in a way that works. But we should, within those societies, throw everything at the wall to see what works for making better decisions. So we should engage in all sorts of experimentation around deliberative democracy and citizen juries to see what works to produce different things, right? If you're blessed of living in a federation like we are in Canada, try all sorts of different things across your subunits of government to try different ways of making decisions, different ways of structuring your public service, different ways of consulting with citizens, and be very deliberate about why you're doing it. You're trying things out so you know what works better, So I think that within whatever set of institutions you're given, you should try as many things as you can to see what will work better for the future, right? And have competitions of ideas and competitions of method to then come up with things that then you can do two things at once when you're engaging in that experimentation. You can test whether these things work a bit better, but you can also explore whether they're normatively acceptable when you do them. I mean, one of the great challenges with deliberative democracy, for example, for those of you who don't know, the kind of model of deliberative democracy, one model is, rather than having politicians make decisions, you get a group of citizens together who are representative of other citizens. You have them reason and deliberate over something, right? So you sort of say, we're trying to come up with a policy around medical assistance in dying. So rather than leaving it to judges or to politicians, let's have citizens talk about it and talk about the moral issues about it, the economic implications, and then come up with a recommendation, right? So it's a great way of making a decision, except we don't know as much as we should about whether those decisions are actually more supported by all citizens once they're made, right? About whether they actually help us resolve the moral dilemmas of these things in the future. But if we experiment with it, and then we actually are rigorous about trying to figure out whether these things are normatively more or less acceptable, then we can know what could work within our democratic societies into the future, right? So to just do a really short summary of the answer to it, we should be humble, there should be humility in democracies about accepting that we've been lucky to have good outcomes, but we don't necessarily know exactly why, right? And we should try to figure out how we can keep getting better and better at coming up with good outcomes in a way that is affirming of these institutions we've been lucky to have.
Roy, do you have your hand up?
Do not, but I do have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, my goodness, I guess we're so copacetic on the same wavelength.
All right.
Question.
I put something in the chat. So
Okay.
first of all, Peter, this was a delightful lecture. I really enjoyed it. As a biogeophysical scientist, I learned a lot. I've got, obviously, anytime you talk about these things, people have their own opinions. And I just wanted to share with you something that I feel is broader than what you talked about in terms of democracy. It touches so many things. And this is what I would call the inability of governments, the inability of societies to look at long-term problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's natural hazards, which is the area I work in a lot, whether it's a whole bunch of different political decisions that go down the road that affect elderly people, or the complexity between younger and elderly people. And this is not being very well, in fact, the current political system in democracies, in my opinion, is absolutely counter to solving this issue. The other thing would be energy issues. That's a huge issue that no government in the world has attacked in a meaningful way. So what's happening, you have people in the US, you get elected on a 4-year term. They spend the first year kind of on a honeymoon, the second year maybe doing something, and the last 2 damn years are spent trying to get reelected again.
Mhm.
And so little gets done. So I don't know that you were saying this, but you sort of implied that, well, this feedback between the people and the idea of serving the electorate is a good thing in democracies. Ideally, yes, but practically, I would say no. And not just in the US. I think it's in a lot of systems. I was always an advocate for the US of having a one-term president, having it 6 years, and get your damn job done and get out of there after that. If you can't do it in 6 years, and you don't get reelected, So I just like to,
Okay, good.
I think we do really bad job on long-term issues
Good.
in
We
so
should-
many areas.
Words.
Yeah, Roy, let me say that I agree entirely with you on the nature of the problem. I might just make the following comments on it, that one thing my colleagues and I have been doing lately is trying to test what the beliefs of politicians are about voters. So we don't actually know very much about what politicians think about voters in terms of what voters care about. So we've just finished a paper where we have data from politicians in more than a dozen countries, where we basically test their theories of democracy. So we ask them, do you think voters care about one issue or many issues? Do you think voters care about the long term or the short term, right? Do you think voters care about, voting on policy or voting on their identity, right? And, there's actually a fair amount of variation in there, but fundamentally, politicians think that voters care only about short-term issues.
Right.
And those beliefs, right, structure their behavior. The problem is that voters can actually be persuaded to do long-term things. That's the issue, right? So if you look at things like, there's a great book by Alan Jacobs called Governing for the Long Term, about pension reform in Europe, right? And it sort of tells a story, which you can see in other places, which is that if politicians grab the nettle and try to articulate why pension reform is a good thing in the long term, they can actually get citizens to think about their own long-term interests, and they will be supportive of something, right? But they have to have some combination of political courage and imagination and capacity to set the agenda, to focus the attention on those long-term issues. So a lot of this has to do not with what voters actually want, Roy, unfortunately, but about what politicians think that voters want, right? And that ends up structuring a lot of their behavior. The trick in all of this, right, is in finding, and this really becomes a question of political and policy acumen, of finding solutions to things over the long term, which have short-term payoffs. And this is, and there's a whole literature in policy work about coming up with ways of designing long-term policies that have immediate benefits they can show to citizens, even small ones, that then lock in a way where if you wanted to change things, it would be very costly for a politician to do it. And I'll tell you, just to give you one example, we've actually fundamentally changed income redistribution in Canada in the last 5 years. Effectively, the government increased marginal tax rates for the rich, even for professors, and then promised that it would basically triple the amount of money it was giving to the working poor in Canada. So now we're at the point where a mother with 2 kids in Canada making $30,000 a year will get $11,000 or $12,000 a year in cash back from the government. It's amazingly supportive. Now, it's not universal, right? But it's at this magical sweet spot of being just broad enough that no government could remove it, because it would be too costly to too many people and they would vote against the government that did that, but not so broad that it's overly expensive and we can't afford it. And that's a great example of a policy that'll be there for the long term. It's actually lifted something like 300,000 children in a country of 30 million above the poverty threshold. Amazing outcome. And it's gonna be very hard for a government to reverse. There's not a lot of policies, Roy, that actually fall into that give you that sweet spot, but there are some, right? So it's not hopeless, but it's just very hard. Yeah.
Thanks.
It was a Bill Morneau decision. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter, for a fantastic lecture and discussion. And you can see the interest is there. We have a very good audience and many people had questions to ask, all of which says that you have to come back here again and continue issues of democracy part 2.
Well, you'll have to twist my rubber arm. So it's been a great pleasure to be here.
So thank you very much, audience, for your participation, and much appreciated. And everyone have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.